Hey there, sleepless rabble. Tonight, by popular demand, or rather by our brave and beloved listener Linda, we're diving into one of the most disturbing stories England ever produced. Yes, we warned you. This one's not your usual cozy cup of crime. It's grim, it's twisted, and honestly, it makes you want to shower in holy water and burn your passport. We're talking about Fred and Rose West, the couple that turned home improvement into a horror genre. What looked like an ordinary house in Gloucester became something that made even seasoned detectives lose sleep. So, if you're here for light bedtime vibes, you might have taken a wrong turn. But if you want to stare straight into the abyss of British suburbia, welcome in. And hey, if you're listening, reacting, or slightly traumatized by now, be like Linda. Send us your dark story suggestions, hit that like button, and subscribe for more tales that will make you question your neighbors. This is Napmax Stories, and you're listening to The Crimes of Fred and Rose West. Let's begin. If you'd wandered down Cromwell Street in Gloucester sometime in the late 70s, you'd have thought it was the kind of place where nothing truly terrible could ever happen. A little dull, perhaps, a bit of peeling paint, a faint smell of coal smoke, but solid, dependable. The kind of street where neighbours knew each other's names, kids chalked hopscotch on the pavement, and gossip spread faster than the milkman. Number 25 blended in perfectly. A modest terrace house with lace curtains and a neatly swept doorstep. Fred West would be out front, cheerful as ever, his shirt half tucked, and a cigarette glued to his lip, fixing someone's garden gate. Rose West might be seen at the window, plump, chatty, a baby on her hip, and another tugging at her skirt. The neighbours said she was a bit loud, but that was Gloucestershire for you. Loud meant friendly, loud meant normal. And it was normal, or at least it looked that way. Fred offered to help with odd jobs. Rose sometimes took in lodgers, and the house always seemed to have someone coming or going. The Wests were the sort of couple you could easily underestimate. Not posh, not polished, but practical. Salt of the earth, some said. A bit rough, said others. No one imagined that beneath the carpet lay a horror story, buried one shovelful at a time. Inside, the decor was exactly what you would expect from a 1970s working-class British household. Brown wallpaper, thick curtains that kept in more than just the cold, and a faint smell of damp and overcooked cabbage. But there was also something else. A tension, perhaps. A silence that didn't fit the cheerful chaos of family life. Visitors often said they couldn't quite put their finger on it. The Wests would smile too widely, talk too fast, and sometimes you'd swear you heard something. A thud, a muffled sound, from somewhere below. Fred would laugh it off. Old pipes, love. This place is ancient. And people believed him. Because you do, don't you? You believe the easy explanation, especially when believing the other one would mean accepting that evil might live next door, offering you a cup of tea and a slice of Victoria sponge. What made 25 Cromwell Street so terrifying wasn't just what happened there, it was how completely ordinary it looked while it was happening. A house of horrors wrapped in floral wallpaper. The sort of place that could sit right across from yours and never once give itself away. Fred West was everyone's favourite handyman. Cheap, reliable, always humming some tune while he worked. He fixed fences, laid tiles, joked about being good with holes. People laughed. In hindsight, that line wasn't nearly as funny as they thought. Rose West ran a noisy, chaotic household. Babies, lodgers, visitors, the smell of Sunday roast. The very picture of British domesticity. Except, of course, for the missing girls. Even as young women vanished from the area, no one thought to look at number 25. The Wests were too visible, too normal. That's how real monsters survive. Not by hiding in the shadows, but by becoming part of the furniture. If you were to walk past today, you wouldn't find the house anymore. It was torn down years ago, erased from the street like a stain the town couldn't bear to see. There's a path there now, lined with young trees, an attempt at healing maybe, but locals still lower their voices when they walk by. Some swear the air feels colder there, as if the ground remembers what the walls tried to forget. Back then, though, it was just another house, another family, another lie we all agreed to believe. And beneath that quiet street, under the concrete floor Fred West poured himself, something began to grow. A secret that would rot the heart of Gloucester. But let's, as always, rewind and start right at the beginning with our infamous protagonist, Fred West, and his childhood. Because every monster, no matter how grotesque, once had sticky fingers and muddy knees. Fred was born in 1941 in the kind of English countryside that looks idyllic until you actually live there. Much Markle, Herefordshire, endless fields, tractors, gossip, and the sort of poverty that gets passed down like bad wallpaper. The West family were farmhands, hard-working, God-fearing, and absolutely terrible at emotional expression. Electricity, optional, violence, standard. Fred's father, Walter, was the kind of man who could fix a tractor with his bare hands and destroy a child's confidence with a single glare. His mother, Daisy, ran the house with the efficiency of a prison warden. There were whispers, always whispers, that the Wests were too close, that Daisy treated her sons like husbands rather than children. But in rural England of the 1940s, nobody asked questions. You kept your head down and your mouth shut. Fred grew up surrounded by animals, mud, and silence. He learned that tenderness was weakness and control was survival. Teachers called him slow, but what he lacked in academics, he made up for in cunning. Even as a boy, he had a sly grin that made adults uncomfortable without knowing why. Then came the accidents. Plural. First, a nasty fall at age 15 that cracked his skull. Then, a motorbike crash that left him unconscious for a week. Doctors later wondered whether those injuries changed something in his brain. Maybe they did. But let's be honest. You don't bash empathy out of someone who never had it to begin with. After the crash, something hardened in him. Friends noticed his temper, the way he looked at girls, not with attraction, but possession. He started stealing, lying, and manipulating. By his late teens, he'd already discovered that pain could make him feel powerful. And once you've tasted that kind of power, it's hard to go back to anything else. The West household, meanwhile, carried on as if nothing was wrong. In those days, as long as you worked, prayed, and didn't kill anyone in public, you were fine. People in Much Markle said Fred was a bit odd, which in British small-town code means deeply alarming, but will still invite him to the fete. By his early 20s, Fred was charming in that scruffy, slightly dangerous way. The kind of man who could fix your car, flirt with your sister, and steal your purse before you noticed. He had no moral compass, just appetite. For sex, for control, for the thrill of getting away with things. He married young, because that's what you did. His first wife, Rena Costello, was a Scottish teenager who soon realised she'd walked into a nightmare. The marriage was a blur of jealousy, violence, and control. Fred treated her like livestock, something to own, not love. When she tried to leave, he found her. When she ran again, he kept the kids. Somewhere along the way, his sense of boundaries dissolved completely. Family rumours suggested he took after his father in all the wrong ways: incest, coercion, dominance dressed as affection. It's an old, sick inheritance, and Fred accepted it like an heirloom. You could call it the making of a monster, but that's too neat. Fred West wasn't shaped by one tragic childhood or one cruel parent. He was built from 1,000 tiny permissions. A society that looked away, neighbours who didn't interfere, and a man who learned that smiling while you lie gets you far. By the time he left Muchmarkel behind, he'd already crossed every line that mattered. He just hadn't learned yet how to bury the evidence. That particular skill would come later, and it would come with help. From a teenage girl at a bus stop who thought she'd found love. Next, we'll meet Rosemary Letts, the girl who watched too much and learned that power could be feminine too. Rosemary Pauline Letts was born in Devon in 1953. A post-war Britain still pretending that family life was wholesome, even when the curtains twitched and the screams stayed indoors. Her beginnings were not tragic in the cinematic sense. They were simply horribly ordinary. Her father, Bill Letts, was a man who enjoyed control the way others enjoyed whiskey. A disciplined, domineering bus driver who expected obedience at all times and blurred every possible line between affection and ownership. Neighbours described him as strict but decent, which, in English understatement, usually translates to deeply disturbing but keeps the garden tidy. Rose's mother Daisy was fragile. Diagnosed with depression and subjected to electroconvulsive therapy while pregnant, she drifted in and out of hospitals like a ghost, trying to remember who she was. Rose grew up watching her mother's blank stares and her father's temper. A dangerous education in what love looked like when filtered through fear. The house itself was heavy with silence, the sort that sits in corners and listens. Rose learned early that attention could be dangerous, but invisibility was worse. So she adapted, observing, copying, anticipating. She became the kind of child who always seemed to know what adults were thinking, or what they didn't want anyone to know. As she grew older, the power dynamics she witnessed began to twist into something else. She learned that control could substitute affection, that cruelty could silence fear. Family members later recalled her unpredictable moods, tenderness that could turn to rage in seconds, and a fascination with pushing boundaries. She'd tease, threaten, and then comfort, all in one breath. Emotional whiplash became her native language. At school, she struggled. Her reading was poor, her attention scattered, but her defiance was sharp. Teachers called her difficult. She'd glare rather than apologize, smirk rather than cry. Other children avoided her, unsettled by her stare. It wasn't cruel exactly, just clinical. Like she was studying how people work so she could take them apart later. By her mid-teens, Rose had already learned to weaponize what she'd absorbed. She mimicked her father's authority, his tone, his contempt. Her siblings feared her outbursts. Her mother avoided confrontation altogether. The home became a closed ecosystem of manipulation and silence. Neighbors noticed small, strange things. Rose standing too close to adult men, laughing too loudly at their jokes, or switching moods mid-sentence. It wasn't flirtation so much as experimentation, testing the edges of power, seeing how far she could go before someone stopped her. No one ever did. There's an old saying that abused children become either victims or mirrors. Rose chose the mirror and made it her armor. By 16, she was already emotionally older than her years, brittle and calculating beneath the veneer of a shy girl from a broken home. She'd sit quietly, observing the world with that same intense stare she'd had since childhood, not daydreaming, but dissecting, watching how people loved, how they lied, how they forgave. Every cruelty she endured became a lesson, every humiliation a rehearsal, and all of it, the neglect, the confusion, the unspoken rules, carved her into someone who didn't need empathy to function, just control. It's easy later to call her evil, but the truth is more uncomfortable. Rose Letts was made, not born. A patchwork of fear, longing, and imitation stitched together under the fluorescent hum of a broken home. By the time she reached 15, she had already decided two things: that love was power, and that power was safety. And then, right on cue, came a man who spoke her language. It started, as these things often do, with a bus stop. Cheltenham, 1969. A teenage girl waiting for the number 27, wearing a cardigan 2 sizes too big. And a man twice her age, leaning against the shelter with a grin that said, "I get away with things." Fred West was 30, married, and already orbiting several disasters. Rosemary Letts was 15, curious, damaged, and bored. The universe, in its usual dark humor, decided to introduce them. He told her she was beautiful. No one had ever said that before. He said she looked smart, which technically was true in a predatory sense. She laughed, nervous and flattered, and he saw what he needed. A girl still young enough to mistake control for love. From that first encounter, Fred began testing her boundaries. He'd show up where she worked, wait outside her house, flatter her mother, then sneer behind her back. It was persistence disguised as affection, obsession rebranded as devotion. And Rose, who had grown up learning that love meant submission, didn't run. She stayed. Within months, she moved in with him, a married man with 2 children and a temper that could curdle milk. The neighbours, of course, talked, but this was England, and gossip was a national sport, not a social intervention. Rose took charge of Fred's household like she was born for it. She cleaned, cooked, disciplined the children, and kept Fred entertained, all before turning 17. When his wife, Rena, turned up to see her daughters, Rose's smile tightened. Soon, Rena was gone for good, and nobody asked questions. Behind closed doors, their relationship settled into a rhythm that would have made the devil raise an eyebrow. Fred demanded obedience, Rose delivered it, and then demanded it back. They competed, fed off each other's cruelty, perfected the choreography of domination. Violence became their version of intimacy. It didn't happen all at once. There were small escalations, slaps that became punches, games that became rituals. Fred liked control. Rose liked watching. He'd test how far she'd go. She'd surprise him every time. They shared a private language of power built on humiliation, secrecy, and the occasional apology that sounded more like a threat. Rose's temper could flatten a room. Fred's grin returned every time he made her cry. It was, in a way, the perfect match. When Rose became pregnant, the domestic chaos only deepened. Babies arrived like clockwork. Neighbors thought it sweet, how devoted she was, always pregnant, always smiling. They didn't see the bruises, they didn't hear the shouting, or maybe they did, and just turned up the radio. By the early 1970s, the West household was operating as its own tiny dictatorship. Fred handled the world outside, fixing cars, laying bricks, pretending to be helpful. Rose ruled the inside, moods, meals, punishments. Together they built a reality where violence wasn't wrong, it was routine. What they shared wasn't love, not really. It was recognition. Two people who'd found in each other the missing piece of their damage. He gave her permission to be cruel. She gave him someone who wouldn't flinch. If there's a hell designed for irony, it's probably reserved for couples like them. The ones who find comfort in their own reflection and call it destiny. Soon, their partnership would take on a new dimension. Fred started digging under the house, expanding the cellar. Storage space, he said. Rose nodded, smiling. She liked when he worked down there. It made the nights quieter. Because sometimes when monsters fall in love, they build something together. In this case, it was a house. If houses had souls, number 25 Cromwell Street would have been damned before the first coat of paint dried. But in the early 1970s, it looked perfectly normal. Another brick terrace in Gloucester's row of forgettable post-war homes. Cheap rent, central location, decent plumbing. It even had a garden, which in England almost counts as luxury. Fred West, the self-taught handyman, was thrilled. A place to raise his growing brood, run a few jobs from home, and maybe, just maybe, dig a few holes without anyone noticing. Rose was equally pleased. It was her stage, finally, a home of her own, where she could run the show. The neighbours thought they were industrious, if a little eccentric. Fred was always hammering something, carrying sacks of cement into the cellar, mumbling about improvements. Rose took in lodgers, young women mostly, to make ends meet. She said she wanted to help girls get on their feet. In truth, she was helping Fred get them off theirs. What they were building wasn't just a house, it was an ecosystem, a perfectly calibrated illusion. Children, lodgers, visitors, noise. Enough movement to mask whatever else went on behind those floral curtains. Fred prided himself on being good with his hands. He was. He could fix anything. Except, apparently, his compulsion to destroy things once they worked. He expanded the cellar, reinforced the floor, added soundproofing. Rose said it was for storage. She wasn't wrong. The strange thing about evil is how domestic it can look. While Fred installed lights and shelves below ground, Rose baked pies upstairs. While he laid bricks around a cavity, she hung clean laundry in the yard. There was a rhythm to their work, a dark choreography performed to the hum of the radio. Sometimes lodgers came and went, sometimes they didn't. But because the West had so many children, visitors, and a revolving door of chaos, no one noticed who disappeared. In those days, transient girls were invisible, hitchhikers, runaways, students looking for rooms. If one stopped sending postcards, people assumed she'd just moved on. Fred and Rose made sure of that. They'd chat to anyone, offer tea, gossip about the neighbours. Fred had the sort of laugh that made people drop their guard, and Rose had a knack for being just inappropriate enough to seem fun. It was a masterclass in camouflage. Inside, though, the atmosphere thickened. The children knew not to go downstairs. Visitors who overstayed their welcome were discouraged with sudden hostility. And still, the radio played, the dinner plates clattered, and the neighbours waved good morning. The cellar itself became the heart of their secret, Fred's pride and joy. He'd show it off to the rare visitor with a handyman's grin. Good place to work, eh? Most smiled politely and backed away. Something about the air down there felt wrong, stale, heavy, almost sour. But people brushed it off. This was Britain. You didn't make a fuss. The truth was, 25 Cromwell Street didn't just hide their crimes, it enabled them. It was designed, piece by piece, to consume. The floorboards creaked with memory. The walls soaked up screams. Fred even told one friend, half-jokingly, that nothing goes to waste in this house. The man laughed. Everyone always laughed. Rose, meanwhile, perfected her double act. Upstairs, she was the friendly mum, loud, laughing, always up for a chat. Downstairs, she was something else entirely. She liked control. She liked to watch. She liked that nobody ever suspected her. In a strange way, she thrived on the theatre of it, the thrill of feeding her guests, knowing some wouldn't see another dinner. Over time, their crimes became routine, efficient, domestic even. They planned around school schedules, meal times, holidays. The horror wasn't in the violence itself. It was in how ordinary it became. If you passed by on a Sunday, you might have smelled roast beef, heard the radio, seen Rose hanging laundry and Fred tinkering with his van. You'd never know that beneath their feet, another young woman was being erased. Some houses hold warmth, others hold secrets, and some, like 25 Cromwell Street, hold both in perfectly balanced deceit. Fred once told a drinking mate, "This place'll outlive us all." He was right, in a way. Even after it was torn down, the legend remained, a permanent address in Britain's collective nightmares. But we're not there yet. For now, the house is still standing, and it's hungry. We've been dancing around the subject long enough. You already know what kind of story this is. So let's be honest about what happened behind that polite front door on Cromwell Street. Fred and Rose West didn't just kill people. They held them captive, they tortured them, and they sexually assaulted them. Together. We'll spare you the grotesque details, but the pattern was deliberate, sustained, and cruel beyond reason. Their victims weren't random, they were chosen. The method always started with an invitation. The Wests offered what desperate young women needed most: a place to stay, a job, or just someone kind who seemed to care. It was the 1970s. Hitchhiking was normal. Trust was cheap, and Gloucester felt safe. That was their camouflage. Once a girl entered 25 Cromwell Street, the tone shifted. The house closed in on her. There were locks where there shouldn't be locks. Doors that only opened one way. Fred's charm turned into command. Rose's smile froze into something else. Cold. Assessing. They worked as a pair. Fred restrained, Rose controlled. The basement became their private theatre. Concrete floor, heavy beams, the hum of a single light bulb. The victims were bound, terrorized, and assaulted. Sometimes over hours, sometimes days. The cruelty wasn't spontaneous. It was structured. Psychological degradation always came first. Intimidation, mockery, false comfort. Then physical and sexual violence. And finally, when Fred decided the game was over, he ended their lives. Afterwards came what he called tidying up. Fred disposed of the bodies himself. Dismemberment, burial, cement. He sealed their remains beneath the same floorboards his children walked on. Police later found bones in walls, under patios, even mixed with building rubble. The cellar became a catalogue of the unthinkable, each patch of concrete a gravestone without a name. And through all of it, Rose managed the upstairs world. Children, lodgers, the daily facade. She made tea while Fred cleaned. She laughed with neighbours while the cement set below. If you asked anyone back then, they'd tell you she was a bit strict, a bit loud, but a mother of many, keeping things together. That's what's hardest to grasp. How easily horror blended into domesticity. breakfast, school runs, screams muffled by walls and radio static. The English way of compartmentalizing horror. Just don't make a scene, love. Keep the curtains closed and carry on. The West perfected that. They divided their lives into compartments. The cellar for violence, the kitchen for appearances. And they moved between them with unsettling ease. One moment, they were monsters. The next, they were chatting about grocery prices. Fred justified it as dominance, a twisted belief that women existed to be controlled. Rose, for her part, seemed to enjoy the power. Not every act was forced on her. Many were initiated by her. The police found evidence that she sometimes took the lead, especially when Fred's temper ran wild. She wasn't afraid of him. She was like him. It's tempting to call what they did madness, but that lets them off too easily. There was nothing uncontrolled about it. Their cruelty had logic. The logic of power without empathy. They destroyed people because they could. And when it was over, they swept, smiled, and went back to being the Wests. Two ordinary Brits in an ordinary house on an ordinary street. That's the method in their madness. Evil disguised as normality. And while others slept, they dug. The West children never stood a chance at a normal childhood. The house they called home was part nursery, part prison, and part something that language doesn't quite cover. Fred and Rose raised at least 9 children. Some theirs, some from previous relationships. 1 or 2 whose parentage even they couldn't agree on. The confusion suited them. Blurred lines made control easier. To outsiders, the Wests looked chaotic but harmless. Noisy, poor, always renovating. The kids played in the garden. Rose shouted from the doorway. A rough family, people said. But plenty of those around Gloucester. No one imagined the children were living on top of graves. Inside, discipline meant domination. Fred's temper was volcanic. Rose's cruelty, clinical. Beatings were routine. Affection was currency. The rules shifted daily depending on who needed power that morning. Some punishments came from belts, others from silence. The children learned early that survival depended on reading the room faster than the adults did. Sexual abuse was constant. It's ugly to say, but truth demands it. Both parents participated. Both enforced secrecy. The older kids were told they were special, that families showed love this way. When neighbors heard crying, Fred explained it away. Kids acting up. When teachers saw bruises, Rose blamed clumsiness. Bureaucracy and British politeness did the rest. Heather, one of the older daughters, eventually stopped pretending. By her teens, she'd had enough of the lies and the nightly fear. She started talking about leaving, finding a job, getting out. Her defiance terrified her siblings. In that house, courage was contagious but fatal. Fred noticed. So did Rose, and the tension built like damp behind wallpaper. Arguments turned to threats. Heather told classmates she feared for her life. Then, one summer in 1987, she disappeared. Fred said she'd run off with a boy. Rose repeated the story until even the younger kids stopped asking. It was the family's first official vanishing inside its own walls. For years afterward, the Wests used Heather as a ghost story. If you misbehave, you'll end up like your sister. The warning worked. The house grew quieter. The children smaller in spirit. They learned to laugh on cue, to keep secrets the way other kids kept diaries. The psychological damage was meticulous. Fred and Rose didn't just control their children's bodies, they colonized their minds. Fear replaced thought, obedience replaced personality. And because this was Britain in the 1980s, As long as the kids turned up at school washed and breathing, no one intervened. Ironically, it was bureaucracy that later saved them. Social workers, police, teachers, all missing the pattern until the very end. Paperwork hid screams better than walls ever could. When investigators finally revisited Heather's disappearance years later, they discovered the truth in the garden, literally. Her remains lay beneath the patio where the family had once eaten dinner. The symbolism was too on the nose even for a horror film, but that's what happens when reality stops caring about subtlety. Looking back, the question everyone asked was how the children survived at all. The answer is simple and bleak. They adapted. They split themselves in two. One self for the world outside, another for the world within. It's what humans do when horror becomes habitat. Fred and Rose prided themselves on keeping a tight family. They did. So tight, it couldn't breathe. And yet, out of that suffocating silence, a few found voices later. Heather's siblings became the key witnesses, the living proof that the nightmare hadn't been confined to strangers in the cellar. The horror hadn't just been buried, it had grown up and learned to speak. In the end, it wasn't detective brilliance that exposed the Wests. It was the persistence of children who refused to stay quiet forever. For years, 25 Cromwell Street looked busy but boring. The kind of address that produces more noise complaints than news stories. There was always hammering, always children shouting, always Rose in the doorway, loud as a foghorn and twice as confident. Gloucester's version of normal. People noticed things, of course. A smell in summer that didn't fade. The odd van delivery at night. Holes being dug, filled, and dug again. But this was England. We don't notice things. We tut quietly and close the curtains. Some neighbours described Fred as odd but handy. He'd fix a fence for free, then ask if they'd seen any hitchhikers about. Rose was harder to categorise. Half gossip queen, half menace. She ran her lodger rooms, sometimes to single women, sometimes to teenage girls who vanished without forwarding addresses. The turnover was high, but so were the bills, and nobody wanted to get involved in other people's finances, or their screaming. Rumours bubbled. Teachers filed half-hearted reports about bruises on the West kids. Social workers stopped by, got tea, left confused. One even wrote that Rose seemed overwhelmed but trying her best. In Britain, that's code for definitely hiding something, but we're understaffed. Fred, meanwhile, had his own way of disarming suspicion. He talked, endlessly, to anyone, about anything. He'd boast about his sex life, his rough games, his building jobs, sometimes all in the same sentence. People laughed awkwardly and backed away. If he was joking, he was creepy. If he wasn't, he was terrifying. Either way, it was easier not to decide. By the late 1980s, the West had achieved a sort of dark invisibility. Too loud to be questioned, too domestic to be suspected. The perfect camouflage. Chaos mistaken for character. Then Heather vanished. Again. The story changed each time someone asked. She'd run off, found work, didn't get along with her mum. Fred even joked that she was buried under the patio. Nobody laughed for long, but they didn't report it either. English humour can be a bit selective. Over the next few years, the family unravelled in slow motion. The children grew older, braver, and the stories they told at school grew harder to ignore. One daughter confided that her father did things. Another hinted that Heather wasn't really missing. Teachers finally compared notes. A pattern emerged. Bureaucracy, having slept through a decade of horror, began to stir. The first official knock didn't come from homicide detectives. It came from child welfare officers. They suspected abuse, not murder. When police accompanied them to 25 Cromwell Street in 1992, they expected to remove children, not uncover graves. But inside that cluttered house, they found enough to realise the truth was bigger than a domestic case file. Rose was cold, polite, defensive. Fred was chatty, over-helpful, too quick to explain. He talked about Heather again, spinning another story before anyone asked. The officers left uneasy, paperwork in hand, bureaucratic wheels finally turning. Then came the smell again. The garden, the concrete, a whisper through Gloucester. They're digging next door. Neighbours lined the street as investigators marked the ground. Television vans arrived, then the national press. Suddenly, the house everyone ignored became the house nobody could stop staring at. When police broke through the first layer of soil and found human remains, the narrative collapsed. Heather hadn't run away, and if she was there, who else might be? The neighbours' quotes to reporters said it all. They seemed nice enough. A bit odd, maybe. You never really know, do you? No, you don't. Especially when horror wears the face of ordinary. And so the West's fortress of silence began to crumble, not because someone was brave enough to confront them years earlier, but because paperwork finally caught up with murder. It began, as many British scandals do, with someone digging where they shouldn't. In February 1994, police returned to 25 Cromwell Street with a warrant, a few shovels, and the uneasy suspicion that Heather West hadn't gone very far at all. Fred, ever the handyman, tried to stay casual. "Oh, that old patio," he joked. "You'll find nothing but rubbish down there." The kind of confidence only a man with a full cellar of skeletons could muster. The officers dug anyway. By mid-afternoon, the smell told its own story. Then came the bones, neatly packed, wrapped, almost clinical. Forensics confirmed it within days. Heather West, buried by the family that still ate Sunday lunch above her. The newspapers didn't so much break the story as detonate it. Overnight, 25 Cromwell Street became National Theatre. Reporters camped outside. Neighbours practiced looking shocked on camera. One headline read, "Police find body at House of Horrors." Another, less creative, simply said, "Evil couple." Britain loves a label. It spares everyone from thinking too hard. Fred basked in the attention. He gave interviews through the bars of a police van, smirking, calling himself a ladies' man. He spoke in riddles, half-truths, jokes that weren't jokes. For detectives, he was both witness and suspect, switching roles mid-sentence. Rose, meanwhile, said nothing, not a word. She sat pale, composed, the perfect Englishwoman pretending she'd never met the man beside her. When police widened the dig, the ground kept talking. Another body, then another. By the fifth, the forensic tents had spread across the garden like white sails on a sea of denial. Each discovery brought new reporters, new neighbours remembering how they'd always had a funny feeling. Funny how hindsight improves under a camera light. Fred tried to control the narrative, as he always had. He offered maps, led detectives to sites, drew sketches on scraps of paper. Sometimes he boasted. Sometimes he wept. He said there were others, but forgot their names. Classic West. Sentimental until it required specifics. He even suggested taking police on a little tour. Charming, in a repulsive sort of way. The investigation expanded into the house, then the cellar. Concrete was chipped away like layers of deceit. Beneath it lay more remains, young women missing for years, some still unidentified. By the time they'd finished, they'd found at least 9 victims on the property, plus others linked to the couple elsewhere. Every room had history, none of it printable. The public couldn't look away. Tabloids printed diagrams of the house as if mapping horror could contain it. Television panels debated whether evil was born or built, conveniently forgetting this was a story about missed social service visits and neighbours too polite to knock. The country was horrified and slightly thrilled. Rose kept her silence. Fred, sensing the tide turning, tried one last performance, blaming his wife, claiming she'd gone too far. It fooled no one. For the first time, his grin began to crack. When forensic teams finally sealed the site, 25 Cromwell Street was no longer a house. It was evidence. The walls stripped bare, the garden reduced to mud and memory. Across the street, someone sold tea to reporters. Children peeked from windows. Life, as always, insisted on carrying on. The remains were catalogued, boxed, named where possible. Each victim left with more dignity in death than they'd ever been given in life. Fred and Rose West had turned a home into a mausoleum, and Britain was now forced to admit it had been watching the facade for years. Still, people asked, how could this happen here? As if geography ever mattered. Evil doesn't need permission, it just needs privacy. Fred West always fancied himself a talker. Give him an audience, and he'd perform. The problem for Fred was that in police custody, the audience takes notes. When detectives first sat across from him, they expected a man cornered. What they got was a man delighted. He smiled, joked, offered tea, told stories that wandered from childhood pranks to the odd accident involving women who had gotten themselves into trouble. It was like watching a man describe murder as if it were Home Improvement gone slightly wrong. Fred treated the interview room like a pub. He wanted to be liked. He called the officers mate, winked, chuckled through his own lies. At one point he even said, "You'll never get the full story. There's too many." It was less confession than brag. Detectives let him talk. It was the easiest job they'd ever had. The horror unfolded between jokes. What emerged, slowly and sickeningly, was a picture of habit. The lodgers weren't accidents, and Heather hadn't been the first. Fred described his crimes in fragments. We tied her up. It went too far. She stopped breathing. Always we. Always with a casual tone of someone remembering a DIY project that didn't pan out. Rose sat in another room, wrapped in silence. If Fred was chaos, she was concrete. Every question met with the same calm denial. I know nothing about that. My husband made me. I was afraid. It was her greatest performance, the abused wife script delivered with deadpan precision. The detectives weren't convinced, but they had to admire the discipline. As Fred kept talking, his story shifted like wet cement. One moment, he took the blame entirely. The next, he hinted that Rose was worse. He claimed to love her, then called her a demon in bed. The contradictions piled up faster than the case files. Forensic evidence began closing the gaps his charm couldn't fill. Fingerprints, personal items, the sheer geometry of burial sites, everything pointed to cooperation, not coercion. The phrase joint enterprise appeared in reports more than once. The media, meanwhile, feasted. Every headline screamed House of Horrors. Every new discovery brought another panel of experts debating evil. Daytime talk shows compared Rose to Myra Hindley. Fred, ever the narcissist, enjoyed the fame. He'd grin for cameras, shout through cell bars, "It's all lies, mate." Britain, predictably, ate it up with tea and biscuits. Detectives soon realized they were dealing with two very different beasts. Fred wanted to confess, but on his terms. He enjoyed the attention, even as he incriminated himself. Rose, on the other hand, was survival incarnate. Her silence wasn't guilt or shock, it was strategy. She knew the less she said, the harder it would be to pin down specifics. After weeks of questioning, Fred finally began drawing maps. Little sketches of fields and yards, X's marking where the truth was buried. He guided officers to more remains, naming women in passing as if reciting a shopping list. There was no emotion, no reflection, only convenience. When the interviews turned toward motive, Fred shrugged. "Things got out of hand," he said. "You know how it is." No one in the room did. By late 1994, the picture was complete enough for murder charges. The tally of the dead climbed to 12, possibly more. Fred's mood darkened, the charm cracked. His final interviews were almost mournful, as if he could sense that the stage lights were fading. Rose still refused to speak. Not a single confession, not a single tear. Just a closed mouth and cold eyes. In the end, the difference between them was simple. Fred needed to be understood. Rose needed to survive. And while the country obsessed over their motives, the real horror lay in how ordinary it all looked on paper. Witness statements, evidence bags, timetables, bureaucracy catching up with evil, one form at a time. Next, we move to the quiet between confession and consequence. The months when Fred West went from man to myth, and when silence became the deadliest weapon left in the room. Fred West had always been terrified of silence. At Cromwell Street, he could drown it in noise, hammering, swearing, the radio on full blast, kids crying in the background. In prison, all of that fell. Away, no cellar to work in, no concrete to pour, no Rose to shout over, just a cell, 4 walls, and the sound of his own breathing. For a man like Fred, that was already a kind of punishment. At first, he tried to treat remand like a slightly inconvenient holiday. He joked with officers, asked for extra sugar in his tea, called everyone mate as if they were down the pub and not investigating a mass grave under his patio. When reporters shouted questions, he grinned for the cameras, desperate to prove he was still the main character in the story. The tabloids helped. House of Horrors killer, monster dad, beast of Gloucester. You could almost see his ego flex through the print. He read every scrap he could get, asking guards what the papers were saying, whether his picture was on the front. For a while, the attention was enough to keep the fear out. If people were talking about him, he still mattered. But fame is a flimsy blanket when the lights go out. As the investigation grew, Fred's options shrank. Detectives stopped treating him like a chatty witness and started treating him like what he was, a serial killer who was running out of lies. His own words were now evidence. Every boast he'd thrown out to impress them boomeranged back in tidy typed transcripts. He tried to adjust the script. One week, he took all the blame to protect Rose. The next, he hinted she was the real devil of the two. He cried, then laughed, then complained about the food. None of it changed the simple arithmetic of the case. Multiple bodies, one house, one very talkative handyman at the center of it all. Rose, meanwhile, had discovered the power of saying absolutely nothing. While Fred spilled and rewrote his life story on repeat, she sat in her interviews like a stone statue with lipstick. I knew nothing. I was frightened. Fred did that. Same 3 notes, over and over. If he was chaos, she was the concrete setting around him. The contrast didn't go unnoticed. Fred's bravado began to look less like charm and more like desperation. He was a man used to controlling the narrative, now watching it slip through his fingers every time a new body was identified. For the first time in his life, his favorite tool, his mouth, was making things worse. By Christmas 1994, the performance was collapsing. Other prisoners wanted nothing to do with him. Even in a place full of criminals, some lines still mattered. The letters he sent to Rose came back unopened. His children wanted answers, not declarations of love. The walls of his cell were no longer a backdrop. They were closing in. On New Year's Day, 1995, Fred West solved his final problem the way he'd solved so many others, by removing the witness. This time, the witness was himself. Guards found him hanging from a ligature made of knotted blankets, a crude noose tied to the bars of his window. On the small table in his cell, he'd left notes, one of them telling Rose he would always love her. It was not an apology. It was a goodbye on his own terms, one last grab at control. Rose's public reaction was a masterclass in selective emotion. Shocked, yes. Sad, of course, but not devastated, not broken. If anything, Fred's death removed the one person who could still drag her down with a badly timed confession. The man who had buried her victims had now buried himself, and legally speaking, that was very convenient. Outside the prison, Britain did what Britain does. It turned the whole thing into a spectacle. Rolling news, somber documentaries, neighbours giving slightly rehearsed sound bites about how they never would have imagined it. Psychologists appeared on breakfast TV explaining psychopathy between segments about weather and baking. Evil, neatly packaged into a face that was now safely dead. For a lot of people, Fred's suicide felt like closure. The monster was gone. The house would be demolished. The nightmare was over. But that tidy story left out an awkward detail. The other half of the couple was still very much alive, very much on trial, and very much not interested in confessing to anything. In the quiet after Fred's death, attention turned fully to Rose. No more husband to hide behind, no more we. Just her, a stack of charges, and a nation ready to decide what kind of woman could live in that house and claim she knew nothing. Because in the end, Fred West slipped out of the story the coward's way. Before a jury could look him in the eyes, before the families could hear him say anything under oath, he left the mess, the memories, and the legal fallout for everyone else to clean up. When Fred West died, Britain thought it could finally exhale. The monster was gone, the nightmare was over, and the nation could go back to quietly pretending that evil only happens in other postcodes. But the story wasn't finished, because half the monster was still alive. Rosemary West, the polite wife, the mother, the woman who didn't know, now sitting in the dock, expressionless, cardigan neat, hair brushed, as if waiting for a bus rather than a verdict. The trial began in the autumn of 1995, and from the first day, the air in the courtroom felt heavy. Not with drama, but with the quiet weight of too much truth. There were no Hollywood moments here. No shouting, no crying fits, just witnesses, photographs, and the steady sound of a nation trying to understand how horror had hidden so well behind floral wallpaper. The prosecution didn't waste time. They laid out the timeline like a grim calendar. Years of abuse, disappearances, and murders. Victims who were offered kindness and ended up in concrete. Girls who thought they'd found safety and instead walked into a cellar. 12 counts in total, each a life that began in trust and ended in terror. Then came the evidence. Polaroids, jewelry, hair accessories, little things that once belonged to people who never got to grow old. Spread out under sterile courtroom lights, they looked heartbreakingly ordinary. That was the horror of it, how normal the objects were. Nothing cinematic, nothing monstrous. Just everyday things stripped of context. The survivors spoke next. One by one, the children, now grown, trembling but steady, gave their accounts. They described nights when the floorboards creak for the wrong reasons, when laughter from upstairs drowned out cries from below. They spoke of rules no one questioned, punishments that made no sense, and the constant smell of bleach in the mornings. One daughter, voice shaking, told the jury, "We weren't scared of monsters. We were scared of Mum and Dad." Another remembered how Heather tried to run, how they all knew it wouldn't end well. Her testimony broke the courtroom's composure for a moment. Even the journalists stopped scribbling. Then came the lodgers, women who'd lived at Cromwell Street and somehow made it out. They painted a picture of Rose as the charming landlady who could flip moods like a light switch. "She'd offer you tea," one said, and then stare at you like she was measuring something. Another described hearing screams through the walls. She'd asked Fred what it was. He told her it was Rose's idea of fun. Rose sat through all of it, her face a mask. She didn't react when her children cried, didn't blink at the word murder. She whispered to her lawyer occasionally, adjusted her cardigan, and looked straight ahead. The tabloids called her the Ice Queen. They weren't wrong. Her defense team tried the obvious. Fred was the abuser, the manipulator, the monster. Rose, they said, was his victim. A woman trapped in a violent marriage, forced to obey. It might have worked, except the evidence didn't cooperate. Her handwriting appeared in house ledgers and notes about cleaning days. Her jewelry turned up in evidence boxes. Her voice appeared on an old cassette tape, berating one of her children. She wasn't afraid of Fred. She was complicit. She was comfortable. The prosecutors kept their tone clinical. They didn't dramatize, they didn't moralize. They simply presented a chain of events too cold to ignore. It wasn't a crime of passion or madness. It was a partnership built on domination and control. Fred and Rose West didn't snap. They planned. That was the real horror. The press, meanwhile, did what it does best. Turn trauma into theatre. Headlines screamed, "Mother of Monsters," and "The Wicked Wife." Commentators argued whether she was born evil or made that way. Morning talk shows debated the psychology of depravity over coffee and pastries. Britain was horrified and quietly entertained. Day after day, the prosecution built the case. Week after week, Rose sat frozen, unmoved. Even when the jury was shown photographs of the cellar, she didn't flinch. When her daughter mentioned being used by both parents, Rose's eyes stayed dry. It wasn't nerves, it was absence. By November, the weight of the evidence was impossible to deny. The jury deliberated for a week. Then, one by one, the verdicts came in. Guilty, 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 10 counts of murder. The courtroom went still. Rose didn't move. Her expression didn't crack. It was as if she'd already rehearsed the moment and decided indifference was her best defense. The judge's words were quiet but sharp. These were appalling and depraved crimes. You will never be released. Outside, the crowd erupted. Reporters called it justice. The families called it survival. No sentence could give back what had been lost, but at least the silence was broken. Rose was taken away to serve a whole life sentence, meaning exactly what it sounds like. No parole, no appeals that mattered, Just time, decades of it, stretching into oblivion. But of course, Rose never vanished. Every few years, her name pops up again. Rose West's new life behind bars. Rose West befriends fellow killer. Even in prison, she managed to stay relevant. Fred had always wanted to be remembered. Rose achieved it by doing nothing at all. The verdict closed one chapter but left the question hanging in the air. Not how they did it, but how they got away with it for so long. Neighbours, social workers, police, all the people who saw something but didn't push further. Evil doesn't hide. It just relies on politeness. And so the curtain finally fell on the West's story. At least officially. But the echoes remained. The children who survived had to rebuild lives from ashes. The victims' families had to live knowing their loved ones were buried beneath a garden that once looked normal. Fred escaped with death. Rose got the slow version. Years, decades, silence. And somewhere in between, Britain learned a lesson it will probably forget the next time horror comes dressed as ordinary. When the trial ended, the cameras packed up, the tabloids moved on, and the country exhaled. But for the children who grew up inside 25 Cromwell Street, there was no fade out. There was just life. The thing you're supposed to start again after surviving something no one should survive. They'd been raised in a house that called itself a family home. In reality, it was an experiment in fear. Every smile had been a test, every bedtime a risk. By the time the police came, the West children had already mastered a survival skill most adults never learn. How to exist without being seen. In the months after the arrests, they were separated. Foster homes, social workers, therapy sessions that felt more like interrogations. Reporters called them the forgotten victims, as if being remembered by name would somehow fix what had been done. Some of the kids refused to talk. Others talked too much, trying to drown the silence before it swallowed them. One of the daughters, in later interviews, said the hardest part wasn't the violence, it was the pretending. We had to laugh in front of people. You couldn't cry or they'd ask why. That's the sort of sentence Britain doesn't know how to respond to. We prefer our trauma tidy, preferably with a charity single attached. The siblings grew up under fake names, new towns, endless press bans. Every time a journalist found them, the story reopened old wounds dressed up as public interest. Some struggled with addiction, some with trust, some with just waking up. Because how do you build a normal life when your childhood was evidence? What's most striking when they speak now, decades later, is how calm they sound. Not peaceful, just practiced. They've learned the art of understatement, that British instinct to make horror sound manageable. It wasn't easy, one said in a documentary, but you get on with it. Translation: the nightmares never stopped, but we learned to function anyway. Their relationship with their mother is another ghost in the room. Rose still sends letters to some of them, written in neat cursive, full of self-pity and denial. She calls herself Mum and insists she was framed. Most letters go unopened. The few that are read are kept in drawers, proof that she still exists somewhere behind concrete walls. None of the children write back. Heather's name, though, is the one that carries through every story. The sister who tried to escape. The one who warned them. The one who vanished first. When the police found her body, it didn't just prove a crime. It gave the survivors a language. They could finally say, "We weren't crazy. It really happened." There's a strange kind of defiance in how they talk now. They don't romanticize forgiveness. They don't pretend closure. They live, work, raise families, keep going, quietly, stubbornly. It's not healing in the Hollywood sense. It's survival with a stiff upper lip and a long memory. Psychologists later described what happened in that house as systemic trauma. The rest of us might just call it cruelty turned into routine. But the point isn't what we call it. It's that these children grew up and didn't become what they were taught to be. They broke the cycle that built them. For years, they stayed silent, partly out of fear, partly out of exhaustion. Then came documentaries, books, cautious interviews. They didn't need to tell gory details. The world had enough of those. What mattered was showing that people can come out of a cellar and still choose the sunlight. There's an irony here, and a lesson Britain still hasn't learned. When the West story first broke, everyone wanted to know about the killers, their psychology, their sex life, their marriage. Everyone wanted to dissect the evil. Almost no one asked about the survivors. It took decades for the focus to shift from horror to humanity. Now, when they speak, the tone isn't rage, it's fatigue. They talk about anonymity, therapy, trying to trust people who aren't wearing uniforms. One of the sons said quietly, "The hardest part isn't remembering. It's being reminded." And maybe that's the truest sentence in the whole story. Because Britain still reminds them. Every headline, every documentary, every time someone new discovers the case and posts about it online. They're living proof that horror doesn't end when the killer dies or the house is bulldozed. It lingers. It echoes. It hides in small, ordinary things. The smell of paint. A knock at the door. A voice that sounds too much like hers. Still, they go on. Not because justice was served, but because someone has to. The children of 25 Cromwell Street are adults now. Scarred, yes, but free. And in a story where freedom was the rarest thing of all, that alone feels like a victory. As for Rose West, she remains in a cell, surrounded by silence. The same silence she once enforced on everyone else. Somewhere out there, the people who survived her still live, laugh, breathe, and rebuild. That's the part of the story she can never bury. When the trial ended, Britain promised itself it would move on. It didn't. The West case slipped from headlines to documentaries, from documentaries to late-night reruns, and finally into the strange half-life of cultural memory. The house was gone, the killers locked away or buried, yet somehow the story refused to stay dead. It became what Britain loves best, a true crime myth, wrapped in politeness and disbelief. 25 Cromwell Street was bulldozed in 1996, the ground paved over and renumbered, as if renaming evil could erase it. But curiosity has a long shelf life. Tourists still came, standing where the front door once was, snapping photos of nothing. The council planted grass, people took selfies on it. That's the modern world for you. Everything is content, even tragedy. Publishers were faster than grief. Books appeared within months, each promising the definitive story. Former detectives wrote memoirs. Journalists wrote exposés. Psychologists wrote theories. They all agreed on one thing. The public couldn't look away. There was something hypnotic about the idea that this had happened in a semi-detached house in Gloucester. The kind of place where people water begonias and complain about parking. Television followed suit. Dramas, reenactments, based on true events films. The casting was always a little too glamorous, the lighting too flattering, the soundtrack suspiciously emotional. And somewhere between the ad breaks, the Wests became entertainment. Rose was reinvented as the archetypal female killer, cold, sexual, manipulative, the British answer to every American serial killer cliché. Fred was reimagined as the dim brute, the working class handyman gone feral. Together they fit neatly into a story Britain could understand. Perversion disguised as domesticity. Evil that looks like your neighbours. The media tried to call it a cautionary tale, but it played more like a grim soap opera. Inside the mind of a monster. The wife who killed. Secrets of the cellar. Catchy titles. Soft narration. Dramatic music. The victims, meanwhile, were reduced to silhouettes and statistics. Their real names fading behind Fred and Rose's infamy. That's how myths work. The villains get billing. The victims get closure. By the 2000s, the case had turned into a cultural reference point. The shorthand for horror hiding in plain sight. Comedians joked about the West's spare room. Tabloids recycled the anniversary every few years. Even academics used them as case studies in lectures about deviant psychology. Everyone had a theory. No one had an answer. And still, people kept asking the same questions. How could this happen? Why didn't anyone stop them? How did no one notice? The real answers were uncomfortable. Because they were ordinary. Because they blended in, because people didn't want to see. That's not dramatic enough for television, but it's the truth. Every generation rediscovers the story and reacts the same way. Horror, fascination, distance. It's easier to see the West as an aberration than as a symptom. Easier to pretend they were born monsters than to ask what kind of society lets monsters build patios over graves. Ironically, the more time passes, the more polished the story becomes. Podcast hosts analyze it with smooth voices. YouTubers recount it over ambient music. The violence becomes content. The trauma becomes trivia. Fred and Rose have achieved what they always wanted. Attention, permanence, a kind of fame. Infamy is still a form of immortality. Even now, decades later, their names trend occasionally, when Rose moves prisons, when a new documentary claims to reveal never-before-seen evidence. Each time, the cycle restarts. Outrage, fascination, fatigue. The story lives on not because the people admire it, but because people can't believe it. Disbelief is addictive. There's something painfully British about the whole thing. The mix of voyeurism and moral outrage. The endless tea-fueled debates about what drives people like that. We clutch our pearls, condemn the depravity, and then tune in for the next episode. Outrage is just another form of entertainment when you package it properly. What's left now are ghosts in paperwork and echoes on film. The real house is gone, but the myth has moved into the collective imagination. And in that version of 25 Cromwell Street, the cellar never really gets filled. The digging never truly stops. Because the story isn't about the West anymore, it's about everyone who looked away. Everyone who still looks, and everyone who pretends not to. So yes, the Wests are gone, the house is gone, but the fascination remains, neatly preserved under glass, labelled true crime, and available on demand. And maybe that's the final cruelty of it all, that the same public who once ignored the screams now pays for the soundtrack. And that was Gloucester's darkest love story. A house that smiled on the outside and devoured everything inside. Fred's gone, Rose is still breathing, and Britain, well, it pretended to move on. The garden was replanted, the street renumbered, and yet the story still hums quietly under the surface, like a bad dream the country never quite woke up from. If you made it this far, you're officially part of the brave few who can't look away from the uncomfortable truth. Evil doesn't live in castles, it rents semi-detached. So if you want more stories that whisper between the headlines, more history's dark corners, more nightmares with wallpaper, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, be like Linda. Send us your suggestions, your morbid curiosities, your late night, please tell me this didn't really happen moments. Because here at Napmax, we don't just tell stories to help you sleep. We tell the kind that make you think before turning off the light. This is Napmax Sleep Stories, and you've been listening to The House That Ate Gloucester. Sleep tight if you can.